Okay, so part 3, the Waco, Texas Biker Massacre. I received the book from Amazon finally. There were some delays in it, and it's written by that guy. Now, in reading the prologue and the back cover of the book, I get the very strong impression that the writer is associated in some way with the Banditos. I see no reason to call that a good thing or a bad thing, but it probably represents something else that the Bandito president was saying on the news. This is very openly broadcast stuff from them, because what was happening is that law enforcement was attempting to control the narrative of the Banditos, and they had to speak for themselves. And in the story, I believe this is effectively the Banditos speaking for themselves. Now, I'm not a Bandito. I'm not associated with them. I'm not associated with any particular biker club. In fact, right now, I don't even own a motorcycle. I had some association in the past with a few people, and found them to be lacking the level of character that I found necessary to have an ongoing relationship with, and that's business or otherwise. I know guys who own Harleys, but as far as the clubs go, my requirements for a certain level of character and integrity in handling your business is at a level which is different from theirs. In that respect, because I've had no personal interaction that I know of with the Banditos, I think I can look at this a little more objectively than perhaps somebody who's in the middle of it. One other observation I made, which kind of confirms a little bit more of what I've heard about this story, and probably the authorization of people in the 1% world to have that story published, was about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months ago. I was in the Seattle area, and I saw a very clear Bandito on his Harley, wearing his colors, riding alone at night on the freeway. Now, that indicates a lot of things to somebody who's observant of the biker world. One, that's basically like a banner bearer. Okay, he's bearing the banner of the Banditos deep in Hell's Angels turf, and he wasn't doing it incognito, and he wasn't doing it in a group, which means that there's probably some sort of a truce in effect. Okay, this guy was not being cautious of being attacked. It was probably a truce in effect. The indications I saw from the book indicate that there probably was some sort of meeting between Banditos representatives and Hells Angels representatives to explain the situation, and that those explanations were accepted as probably truthful. And that's given the circumstances of what was going on. It's also given the circumstances of the fact that the Cossacks were an associated club where what's explained in the book is that several chapters of the Cossacks were about to be patched over, which means that the entire club, some of the chapters were under control of law enforcement, either informants or directly under the control of agents, were going to be able to change their patches and declare themselves as Hell's Angel chapters in Texas. Now, at one level, that's an offense to Banditos territory. At another level, it's a major threat to the Hells Angels international organization. And I believe that's the point that the Banditos eventually were able to drive home with the Hells Angels. That the local offense to the Banditos was not necessarily a threat, although there's a fair amount of threatening bravado involved with any sort of a brawl or war or back and forth type of problem. But as a security threat to the Hells Angels, allowing the patching over or conversion of entire chapters of the Cossacks Club to become Hells Angels would have created a threat to the Hells Angels international organization. That's what explains to me the confidence with which a Bandito would be able to openly ride through Hells Angels turf alone. My guess is similar things have been happening in other Hells Angels turfs as a declaration of peace between the Hells Angels and Banditos. Somebody could tell me otherwise. Somebody better informed than me could tell me otherwise, or post in their own thing. But at that point, it would also explain why there's been a lack of retaliatory strikes between Hells Angels and Bandito support clubs or anybody like that. The reality is they both have a lot of people in jail right now being held hostage. The story that was told by that guy makes a lot of sense given the players involved. It would mean that the series of conflicts were to be instigated under the watchful sniper eyes of Texas law enforcement, and that they would have been perfectly happy to see a bloodbath. Now, the responsibility of a government to see to the welfare of the general public and the veterans and people like that, we also have to look at the fact that the Cossacks were in a very strong recruiting drive, supposedly in a roundabout way on behalf of the Hells Angels, and recruiting hotheads, recent combat veterans, people who would probably get it on if there were a biker war. In the midst of that, the Bandidos representatives believe strongly that they had sufficient evidence that indicated that a lot of this was also being done with the guidance and help of certain law enforcement agencies that simply want to fill jail beds and widen the net of people who could be arrested in the course of this so-called biker war. And that the bigger it got, the more people they'd be able to bust. Now, that's a theory that maybe is difficult to prove, but that guy, the author of the book, feels that his people are holding what they feel is sufficient proof that that's what was really going on. From the outside, I can look at news reports and the narrative of public press releases from law enforcement and claiming that there was a biker war that was going to go on, that everybody against everybody, that the biker clubs would fight each other, and then the biker clubs would also be fighting law enforcement. There would be a consensus that that narrative will provide the justification for the killing of bikers on site within whatever area of Waco. And I mentioned that in some postings because it was effectively a declaration of war. Now, the person who made that declaration of war was one of the senior law enforcement officials in Waco. When the Bandidos president had to go on the news himself and speak for himself and say, listen, we could not take that level of heat, we can't afford this level of warfare. Was he surrendering? Not necessarily, but apparently emissaries were sent to Hells Angels International and national level organizations to explain their side of the story, and that side of the story was fully accepted. Just because a motorcycle club may be the dominant club in the world doesn't mean that other clubs in the 1%er world don't clearly represent interest in a particular area or interest in their own types of business circles in general. For those of us in the patriot movement and the survivalist movement and that sort of a thing, we would look at this in examining the methodology of how the infighting is guided, because there are other developing circumstances in other places where people have embedded themselves in various militia, patriot, survivalist type groups and are trying very hard to cause problems within groups and without groups. A lot of this we've begun to see in the Pacific Northwest. It is my belief that some other situation has taken place in Tennessee, which a lot of those people are currently being hush-hush about. We don't really know, but I've seen some relatively cryptic videos, not from James Yeager himself, but some of the people somewhat associated with him. I would also like to point out that after the Pack Your Bags video series, there were certain people who embedded themselves within the orbit of his Camden, Tennessee little thing. And when those people embedded themselves into that, part of their organization was an attempt to find people to set up and burn, and that was part of what involved Mark Kessler. Mark Kessler decided to be a copycat lightning rod and attract a lot of the people that he felt would be the extremists and set them up and take them down according to his own statements. So we know these types of things are happening. We know that certain elements within the government are trying to stir shit up. Now the bikers, I believe, among the 1%ers, saner heads have prevailed. Okay, saner people. Regardless of how much dope these guys are on, they tend to work among each other to figure out who is a little bit more sane than the other ones and can help make the same decisions, which others are going to follow. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge from the outside that there was a lot of killing going on. There was a whole lot of killing going on. A whole lot of people who had an interest in making sure that it would grow into a bigger problem took action which would make that grow into a bigger problem. And when I look at the people who made very public statements and saying, yes, there's a war on and here's who it is, versus other people who said there's no war going on and we can't really afford this problem, then we begin to have a closer look at who's really at fault in this and who is the ongoing offender in trying to create a bigger problem than whatever would have taken place without their involvement.